Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video, as you will have already seen from the thumbnail, is how I sewed up this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, for the outer I'm using this gorgeous 100% wool, and for lining 100% viscose. And on to the cutting out. This is my front. I have 2 layers of outer fabric underneath this pattern piece, and then a few notches. So I have a notch just to indicate the bottom of my lapel, the usual sleeve notches, and then I have one dart on the front and a couple of notches to mark the legs. I've already popped a pin in at the point of the dart, and now just 2 more pins to mark my pocket. And now to pop a chalk mark just where that pin pierces the fabric at the bottom of my dart. So that's that done. Ready to draw in my dart legs. So just lining up my ruler with that dot and the notches you see me snip. So that's those done. And the only other thing to mark on this piece is that pocket opening. So off camera I've just drawn a line between those 2 pins on both pieces. So that's my front all cut out and marked. Now to pin up my darts. Starting at the point and then making sure those 2 chalk lines top and bottom are lined up and pinning. Ready to stitch. Starting at the bottom of the dart legs, back stitching, following that chalk line the whole way up, taking it nice and easy here, trying to be as accurate as possible, and pulling my threads at the point. So I'll tie those threads off and give it a nice press off camera, which you can see I've done here. So happy with that. So now for the pockets. This is my pocket flap. My fabric underneath is on the fold, and I'm cutting this twice. I just want to give that fold line a bit of a crease, as I want to add a little bit of structure here, and that crease line will give me a nice marker to line up this interfacing. I'm using a press-on canvas type interfacing, and now I just want to run a line of stitching along these 2 bottom edges. This will just ensure that these 2 layers don't move about when I'm trying to place them on the coat. So sewing within my seam allowance, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching to start and to finish. So that's that done. And off camera I've just placed a little bit of that same interfacing across my pocket opening on the underside. That will just add a little bit of strength there. And now just lining up that pocket flap with my chalk line and pinning into place. And ready to stitch. Again, stitching within my seam allowance, using that same little bit of a longer stitch length, back stitching to start and to finish. So that's how that looks. So now for my pocket bags. So I have 2 layers of outer fabric underneath this pattern piece, and I'm going to line up that straight edge with my chalk line, pin, and ready to stitch. So this time I'm stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, using a regular stitch length, back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. So happy with that. So that's my pocket flap and one of my pocket pieces on. So now for my second pocket piece, I have 2 layers of lining fabric underneath this pattern, and again I'm lining up that straight edge with my chalk line and pinning into place. And ready to stitch. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. So that's how that looks. So now I just need to cut open along that chalk line. So I'm folding my fabric in half and giving myself a little snip there in the center. And then slipping my scissors in through that hole, cutting along the chalk line, stopping an inch or so away from my first stitch, and from there cutting at a diagonal to my first stitch on both sides. So you can see that here. So I'll finish that bottom edge off camera and ready to feed my pocket pieces through to the underside. Making sure everything's lined up as it should be, and after a nice press, this is how it looks. So super happy with that. So now to close up the pocket. So I'm just going to run a stitch line over the top of the welt at the side, making sure that I'm catching that little triangle, and then at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, so around the pocket bag and up to the other side. Back stitching to start, taking it nice and gentle around those curves, and back stitching to finish. So that's that done, nice and neat. And once it's had a good press, this is how it looks. So that's all of the prep work on my front complete. So I'm going to set this aside for the minute to work on the sleeves. I have 2 layers of outer fabric underneath this pattern piece and a good few notches around this one. So I have the usual notches for front and back. I have a dart across the shoulder, and I'm just snipping down to about 1 millimeter away from the point, a notch at the bottom edge in the center. So that's that done. So now to deal with that dart. So I'm just laying one side over the other, lining up those raw edges and pinning into place. And ready to stitch. Back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance until I get to about 1 millimeter beyond that cut edge. Pulling my threads to finish, so happy with that. I'll tie those threads off camera, and after it's had a good press, this is how it looks. So now for the bottom part of the sleeve. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath this pattern piece, a little notch at the top in the center. So that's that done. And here I'm just laying my 2 sleeve pieces right sides together, lining up my notch and pinning. Ready to stitch. Back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance and back stitching to finish. So that's that done. So I've went ahead and pressed open that seam off camera. I've used my clapper to make sure everything's nice and flat. And now I want to run some top stitching on each side of that seam. So I'm just lining up that seam with the edge of my presser foot. My needle is all the way over to the right. I'm using a little bit of a longer stitch length, trying to make sure that that seam is lined up the whole way along. Back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. So that's how that looks, and I want to do exactly the same thing on the other side of the seam. So just finishing that second line, back stitching, and I'm super happy with how this has turned out. So I'll press that seam down off camera. This is how it looks. And while I was at the pressing table, I just added some of that same interfacing to the hem. The only difference this time is I've cut the interfacing on the bias, just to give a bit of a softer finish. So now that my prep work on the sleeve is complete, I'm ready to add this to my front. So lining up my notches, my fabric is right sides together and pinning and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance and back stitching to finish. So that's how that looks, and I'll give that a bit of a press off camera. I've used my clapper here again just to make sure that the seam's nice and flat. And now I want to give this seam the same finish as I gave on the sleeve. So I want to run that 2 lines of top stitching on each side of that seam. So just finishing my first line here, and I finished my second line off camera, and this is how it looks. So now that that's done, I'm ready to add this to my back. So my fabric underneath is on the fold. I have the usual notches around the sleeve, a notch at the neck in the centre. So that's my back all cut out and notched and ready to be added to the sleeve, which is now attached to the front. So just laying my fabric right sides together, lining up those notches and pinning, and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way round and finishing with a back stitch. So that's that done. So now that just needs a bit of a press and that same finish as I did on the front added. So those 2 lines of top stitching, and once done, this is how it looks. So happy with that. So now to close up those side seams. So just laying my front over my back, right sides together, and pinning from the bottom of the sleeve right down to the hem of the coat. And ready to stitch. Back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. And finishing with a back stitch. And I'll press that seam open off camera. And this is the result. And now that that's done, I'm ready for my collar. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath this pattern piece, a little notch at the shoulder, and now to join these 2 pieces together, just laying one over the other and pinning, and stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start and to finish. So that's had a good press, and now this piece is ready to be added to my stand. My fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a little notch to indicate my shoulder and one at the centre on the fold, and I'm cutting this piece out twice. So I've ran some of that interfacing along one piece, and I'll set that aside. You'll see that again later when I come to add my facing. But for now, I want to line up that straight edge with the bottom of my collar and pin into place. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. So I just need to trim down that seam and press it out nice and flat. So just folding my fabric at the seam line and snipping out a little triangle. This is just going to reduce the amount of fabric in the seam and make it a little bit less bulky, and also help everything to lie nice and flat. And once it's all done, this is how it looks. So now to press. So I'm popping my collar on top of my sleeve roll, applying a good amount of steam, placing my clapper on the seam and pressing. So that's that done. nice and flat. So now this piece is ready to be added to the neckline of my coat. So just lining up my notches, my fabric is right sides together and pinning. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. So happy with that. So now I need to do exactly the same thing here again as I did when I was joining the two pieces of my collar. So I've trimmed and pressed off camera, and this is how it looks. And while I was at the pressing table, I've also added some interfacing from the lapel notch down to the hem. This is just going to add a little bit of structure. And I've also added some bias cut interfacing to the hem, just like I did on the sleeve. So that's my jacket outer complete. So I'm going to set it aside for now and work on the facing. So I have 2 layers of outer fabric underneath this pattern piece, a little notch at my lapel. So off camera I've added a little bit of interfacing just to the top half above that lapel notch. And now this piece is ready to be added to my neck facing. So my fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a notch at the fold line, top and bottom, and a notch to indicate my sleeve seam. And just like the front, I've added some interfacing here. And now that that's done, I'm ready to join these 2 pieces together. So just laying my front facing over my neck facing, lining up the shoulders and pinning. And stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start, and finishing with a back stitch. And that seam's had a good press off camera, and this is how it looks. So now this piece is ready for the collar. So my fabric underneath this piece is on the fold. I have a little notch to indicate my shoulder and one at the top and bottom of the fold line. I've added a little bit of structure to this piece with that same interfacing. And now, just like the under collar, I want to add the stand. So this is the piece I set aside earlier that I interfaced. So just lining up my notches and pinning. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. Back stitching to start and back stitching to finish. And again, just like before, I'll trim out that seam and give it a good press. So you can see that here. And now that these are joined together, trimmed and pressed, I'm ready to add them to my facing. So again, just lining up my notches, pinning into place, and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start and to finish. And I went ahead and trimmed out that seam, pressed it out really well. So happy with that. And now that that's done, my collar and facing are ready for the lining. So I have 2 layers of that lining fabric underneath this pattern piece, the usual sleeve notches, and then I have 1 dart on this piece. The only difference is it ends at the side seam rather than the shoulder. So that's all pinned and ready to be stitched. Starting at the bottom of the dart legs, back stitching, following that chalk line the whole way up, and pulling my threads to finish. And after a good press, this is how it looks. So happy with that. And now for the sleeves. Just like the outer fabric before, I have 1 dart at the top and the same notches. And off camera, I went ahead and sewed up that dart and joined these 2 pieces together. And then for my back lining, The only difference here is I have a little pleat just at the back neck in the center, and I've indicated that with a couple of notches. And to create that pleat, I'm just folding my fabric right sides together along the center back seam, lining up those notches, popping in a pin, and I'm just going to stitch down by about an inch, back stitching to start and to finish. And I've just flattened out that little pleat and given it a press. And now, just to secure that pleat in place, I'm running a line of stitches over the top within my seam allowance, back stitching to start and to finish, using a little bit of a longer stitch length. So that's that done. So that's my front, my sleeve and my back lining prepped, and off camera I've just joined all of these pieces together in exactly the same way as I did the outer, and now this is ready to be added to my facing. So just laying my facing over the top, right sides together, lining up my centers, my sleeves and my shoulders, and pinning, and ready to stitch. So starting at the center of the neck and working my way down to the hem, back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, taking it nice and easy here, making sure those edges are lined up the whole way down, and back stitching to finish. And of course I do exactly the same on the other side, and once both sides are sewn and had a good press, this is how it looks. So happy with that. So now that that's done, I'm ready to add this piece to my outer. So just laying my two pieces right sides together, lining up my notches, lining up my edges, and pinning the whole way around that outer edge. And ready to stitch. And just like before, I'm starting at the center of the neck, back stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, coming up to the edge of the collar, pivoting, down to the lapel join, pivoting again, across the top of the lapel, pivoting for a third time, and then the whole way down that center front. Trying to stick to my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way around, finishing with a back stitch. So I've trimmed down my seams off camera in exactly the same way as I did before. I've trimmed out that little join where my collar and lapel meet, and trimmed down that center front seam, ready for a good press in preparation for understitching, which is what I'm going to do next. So the seam that I've just sewn is pressed over to the left hand side, and I'm stitching through the outer fabric on top and that seam underneath, just about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the seam you've just seen me sew. And I'm doing that around the collar, around the lapel, until I get down to that lapel notch, and then I'm going to move my seam allowance to the right hand side, move my needle over, and continue that understitching the whole way down to the hem. That's just going to help the lapel to fold exactly where I want it to fold. And once both sides are done and they've had a good press, this is how it looks. So super happy with this. So now I'm on the home straight, just have a little bit of hand stitching to do here. So I want to join my collar stand seam allowances together at the neck. This is just going to give a really nice finish and make sure every seam stays where it should be. So I'm using a silk thread and a super fine needle. I'm just making sure that my seam allowances are nice and flat there, and I'm joining up those two edges. just with some basic running stitches. And I'll finish that off camera. So that's the top part of the stand joined, and I need to do exactly the same with the bottom part. And this is how it looks when it's all done. So that's my two collar stand seams all nicely joined together. So now for the sleeve hems. So I'm just popping my hand in between the lining and the outer fabric at the hem, coming up through those two pieces of fabric until I get to the hem of the sleeve, making sure the underarm seam of the outer fabric and lining fabric are lined up, pinching them at their edges and pulling the whole thing through those two layers to the outside. Now just to line up those edges the whole way around and pin. And ready to stitch. Back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. Finishing with a back stitch. So that's that done. So that's my lining joined to my outer fabric at the sleeve hem. So now these two pieces aren't joined currently, so I want to join them with a line of hand stitching. So I'm just anchoring my thread at the sleeve seam and then going in between the two layers of fabric, picking up a little fibre from the sleeve hem, a little fibre from the outer, coming back to the outside, taking a tiny little stitch there and back in through again. And I'm going to repeat that process the whole way around the sleeve. And once it's all done, this is how it looks. So that's just going to give a really nice finish and help everything to hang as it should. And now that that's done, I'm ready to close up my hem. So just lining up my edges along the facing and outer, pinning into place until I get to the edge of the facing, and then I'm pulling up my outer fabric to meet my lining. This is going to give me a little ripple there just in the corner, but that's totally fine. That's exactly what I'm after. Lining up my seams and finishing pinning. So I'm going to stitch across the facing, back stitch, take a little step down, back stitch again, and sew across until I get to those double pins, back stitch, and repeat on the other side. So starting with the back stitch, coming up to the edge of my facing, back stitching, taking that little step down, back stitch to start, making sure my edges are lined up the whole way across, coming up to those double pins, taking a few back stitches here just to make sure that edge is nice and strong, moving across to the other side and repeating. So this is just going to give me a nice gap at the hem to pull everything through to the right side. So that's my little step down at my facing edge and my gap in the center. So now to turn everything right side out. So just pulling everything through that little gap, and once it's all pulled through, this is how it looks. So you can see there where I took that little step down, I've got a nice diagonal there and my fabric's all nicely lined up at that edge. So super happy with this. So now just to close up that little gap in the middle, so just running a line of hand stitches between the outer hem and lining hem at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, so picking up a little bit of fabric from the outer, a little bit of fabric from the lining, and repeating. So now I just want to do exactly the same thing here as I did on the sleeve hem. So off camera, I've just joined these two pieces together with that same hand stitching. I've given the whole thing a good press, added a couple of snap fasteners down the centre front, and with that, this little coat is complete. So I have those pockets all in nice and neat, my lapel and collar in, got that gorgeous top stitching around the sleeve and the top of the arm, and inside my facing and lining, nice and neat and tidy, and on the back my collar all nice and flat and that same top stitching, and this is what it looks like on. So I could not be happier with how this has turned out. It's super comfortable. I love all of that top stitching. I love the shape of the lapel, the shape of the collar. Those sleeves are just gorgeous. The pockets, the fabric. And if you've been following along over on Instagram, you will have seen the inspiration for this one. And I think I've got it as close as I can get it anyway. Love how this turned out.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you guys in my next one. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye, folks!